Hi.
Good afternoon, colleagues from different
permanent missions, civil society, and NGOs. And we have also participants in online. Our topic is towards a just approach to the global housing crisis and migrants. Before starting, this is Mr. Gautam Kumar De, counselor from Bangladesh Permanent Mission. After formal discussion, we have a Q&A session, and we will ask for questions from the floor and at the same time from our virtual attendees. You know, the right to adequate housing is an important human rights for all. And in Bangladesh, there are many people who do not have any adequate housing. However, our governments have been trying best to provide adequate housing. In last 2.5 decades, we have provided more than 500,000 houses to the homeless families with a piece of cultivable land so that they can live a good life. And at the same time, you know, we are living in a very complex world where migrants are sometimes mentioned as the problem creator for the housing crisis, which is not right at all. And you know, the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing will present a report in this session of the Human Rights Council tomorrow, highlighting this issue, the global housing crisis and the issue of migration flow, international migration flow. So before starting, I want to request our speakers to keep their interventions within 5 minutes. And for all participants, please be informed that this meeting will be recorded. So our first speaker is Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who is the UN Special Rapporteur to on the right to adequate housing. He is a professor of law and development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the MIT. A lawyer by training, he is an expert on many areas of human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, the UN system, and the human rights challenges posed by development activities. Mr. Special Rapporteur, could you tell us more about why you have chosen the topic of migration for your report to the Human Rights Council?
Thank you very much. And thank you to you for sharing this, and my gratitude to all the panelists and all of you who are here. Migration is always in the news as a source of problems. Migrants are seen negatively mostly as creating issues and are blamed for a variety of social ills that countries have. Among those chiefly is the question of access to housing. Housing is an enormously challenging issue in general, but in recent years, the lack of access to affordable and adequate housing has emerged as a major political and electoral issue. Elections are won or lost based on how those who are competing in elections actually characterize both the source of the housing crisis as well as their potential or proposed solutions for them. While the increased focus on housing is absolutely justified, and I welcome that, and the focus on affordable housing, the lack of affordable housing is a massive global crisis, an issue on which I submitted another report last year, in fact, to the Human Rights Council. Unfortunately, what I see is a tendency on the part of leaders of many countries, particularly in the global north, to blame their housing crisis essentially on migrants. By migrants, I mean not just economic or labor migrants, but refugees or asylum seekers and victims of trafficking, anybody who's simply different from local citizens and residents. And unfortunately, in many countries, this has proved to be a winning strategy politically in the short term. But I wrote this report because of my disagreement with the factual basis as well as the potential negative human rights consequences, which we are already seeing from this attitude of blame the migrants for your problems that we see in many countries. Also, to point out the other side of the issue, which is that rather than being the cause of the housing crisis in countries around the world, in fact, migrants are among its worst victims. Although a lack of affordable housing or homelessness may affect many residents, local residents as well, if you look at, in fact, some of the worst victims of these crises, you find that migrants are among those who are most negatively impacted. In other words, they are the bottom of the pile when it comes to who gets affected by housing crisis, which is very real. So what I propose in the report is a double-pronged strategy, because we've got two problems before us. One is the migration issue. There, calmer heads have to prevail, and we have to recognize that despite all the heated rhetoric about migrants overrunning borders, the data simply doesn't bear it out. Migration data shows that, in fact, mostly it's remained within a certain band between, fairly steady, between the mid-60s to now. The number of refugees and certainly internally displaced people has gone up in recent years particularly because of conflict in certain areas of the world. It's not global again, it's certain areas of the world, as well as beginnings of perhaps larger numbers of people displaced by the consequences of climate change as well. But it's too early to characterize these as overwhelming phenomena that have somehow overwhelmed housing markets in countries, and therefore they have to be seen as the root causes of housing crises in countries. It's too early and it's too easy to blame migrants for housing crisis. And I hope that calmer heads prevail and we look at the hard data on what is really going on and the facts about migration. And we also look at the actual conditions of people who enter other countries, who usually are in extremely vulnerable situation, whether they are in transit camps or temporary encampments, or they end up in refugee camps that become protracted over many, many years. Or we are talking about migrants who don't enter as refugees, but nevertheless face enormous challenges in accessing the housing market, because they're openly discriminated against, for example, by landlords, or they get, they encounter extremely varying criteria for accessing housing. They get denied access to even nighttime shelters, for example, in many countries. So these are major, major issues. I also think that we need to look at migration not simply as a problem, but we also have to look at it in terms of its potential benefits. The reality is this, that many areas of the economy, and there I would count the real estate industry and the housing market, cannot function without migrant labor, especially in many rich countries. So it's very odd that housing crisis is blamed on those very people who in fact build houses. This is a very unfortunate trend, and we have to look at the benefits of migration as well on housing, both in terms of contribution to the improvement and the growth of the housing market in countries, as well as through remittances, the impact of remittance flows on improving housing in the sending countries. These are very big numbers and the impacts are real, which are beneficial. So we have to have more of a global approach in understanding the impacts of migration as well. So what I have proposed in the report is both a set of very concrete steps to, for example, reduce discrimination and improve access to housing by migrants. For example, to kind of have more of a firewall between the parts of the government that deal with immigration and the parts of the government that deal with social services and housing. It's very important that that firewall be maintained, and we see that already producing good results when it comes to access to education or healthcare. Why not do it for housing? And we need to do it. And I also propose a global framework for dealing with migration in a more orderly way. for which some beginning of a conversation and global agreements have been pursued, including through the global compacts on migration and refugees. But the momentum has run out, and we just need better, more multilateral approaches to deal with this. The problem goes beyond the capacities of one country or more, two countries. It needs a global approach and a global solution. So let me leave it at that and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur. Today we have another distinguished speaker from Permanent Mission of Kenya. You know, Kenya in recent years have made important progress in the issue of right to adequate housing and also in the context of migrants and refugees. Kenya has adopted the Shirika Plan, which has potential of prompting a paradigm shift in refugee policy of Kenya, fostering the transition from refugee camps to urban settlement. So now I request His Excellency Mr. James Dirangu, Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of Kenya, to say about something about the Kenya's Shirika Plan and the lessons learned from it.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words and for the introduction, fellow panelists, distinguished delegates, guests. I'll just get straight to it. It's a pleasure to join this panel, but also for inviting Kenya to participate in this discussion. As you know, we have been a long-standing and major refugee hosting country, presently hosting about 800,000 refugees, migrants, asylum seekers. At the very outset, I want to thank the Special Rapporteur, and I'll join him in a call that we must reject the scapegoating and reject the narrative that migrants are a primary cause for the global housing crisis. We know that that crisis is rooted in systemic issues of inequality, of lack of affordable housing, climate change impacts, displacements. And here I'll use the term migrants in its loosest term and widest term possible, which will include asylum seekers, refugees, labor migrants, students, and any other person irrespective of their legal status, their origin, their cause, their motive or pathway to their present circumstance. And also just want to reiterate the call and say the benefits of migration. Kenya knows firsthand what the positive contribution that migration and migrants bring. Migration has been a long historical and ongoing driver of economic and social development. The remittances that Special Rapporteur have talked about contribute significantly in Kenya to the housing situation. So I agree we must both all value the positive impact of migrants in both the sending and the receiving countries. Kenya espouses a rights-based approach when it comes to housing. It's a constitutional right under Article 43(1)(b) of our Constitution, which provides that every person has a right to accessible and adequate housing and to reasonable standards of sanitation. So, based on this constitutional imperative and directive, Kenya embarked and shifted its approach to refugee management, transitioning from camps, which were temporary in nature, to integrated settlements under what is now the Shirika Plan. Shirika is just a word in Kiswahili that means coming together. So it's the Coming Together Plan, which is a multi-year plan that aims to promote social economic inclusion and self-reliance of refugees in Kenya by transforming, like I said, from transitioning camps into integrated settlements. And these integrated settlements refers to the places where refugees and host communities live together in shared spaces with equitable access to housing, infrastructure, and services. There are 6 pillars, but the adequate housing falls under the second pillar, which is on the integrated service delivery. It entails housing and infrastructure, which includes access to basic services, education, water, roads, energy. And this is all underpinned in a very robust framework for the benefit of both the refugees, and the local host community. It is good that this is a project that has undertaken a whole of government, a whole of society, a whole of development partner approach so that no one has been left behind. So Shirika Plan is a joint effort of Kenya and fully supported by the United Nations and the donor community. Its governance is very well structured, and this has led to what we see as a smooth and successful implementation of the plan. Transitioning some of these communities, transitioning can be a difficult thing. I think you've talked about the local sentiments and politics. But what is very crucial is the requirement not only to have conducive environment, but more so also have policy and sufficient financial resources. But we also know that housing does not occur in and of itself in an isolation. And Kenya has also moved further to improve the environments of the Kakuma and Dadaab town, now which are municipal towns, but had started as transition refugee camps, which brings them to full municipality. Maybe just to give you a point of view, our Kakuma and Dadaab are what you'd call in Australia out there in the outback. Something happened in the middle of nowhere, and then now you have a fully fledged municipal town that was hosted and started as a refugee camp. We have our pledges under the Global Refugee Forum. Allow me to skip that. But just to say that we have seen that in the phased approach between the transition phase, the stabilization phase, and a resilience phase, which has been projected over 10 years, Kenya is ready and openly to receive sector funding. And this is why we call upon the international financial institutions and organizations to join. We see this Shirika Plan as a way of the future movement from closed encampments to new urban settlements that favor mobility, that favor freedom of movement, that favor economic inclusion, and refugee participation in Kenya's development processes. And further to this, Kenya has also undertaken other policy changes. And in the new Refugee Act, we've provided access to refugees to the labor market and to financial inclusion, which are all positive steps. So burden sharing becomes imperative, and this is where we see the demand of a coordinated and multilateral response, especially in the escalating humanitarian crisis, particularly in Africa. So the responsibility of providing adequate housing and essential services to refugees and asylum seekers cannot fall disproportionately onto host countries with limited resources, as sadly the case may be presently. I therefore urge all social impact organizations and all of us to invest in this new frontier, and also because it also presents a business case for the private sector. We will not move anywhere if we don't talk about the durable solutions, addressing the root causes of displacement in the first place, be it conflict, persecution, or climate change. So as I conclude, I want to reaffirm the importance of dignity for every person. Together, we must work to create a world where refugees and host countries and host communities can build a future filled with dignity, prosperity, peace, security, and development. I do thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for enlightening us on the progress of Shirika Plan. Today, we have another speaker who is very relevant for this topic of migration. He is Mr. Louis Hoffman from IOM. Mr. Hoffman is a Senior Coordinator for Peace, Recovery and Solutions. He recently concluded a 2-year assignment with the Office of the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Solution to Internal Displacement, and previously held various managerial positions at IOM in Geneva and the field. He has an extensive field background in crisis context, having served in Sudan and South Sudan, as well as previous posts in Serbia, Afghanistan, Austria, Timor-Leste, and Republic of North Macedonia. I want to know from my IOM colleague, how does IOM contribute to the respect, protection, and fulfillment of the right to housing of migrants across the globe?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for this invitation, and it's a pleasure to be with the distinguished panelists here. We certainly welcome this report on a just approach to the global housing crisis and migrants, and we appreciate what we think will be the excellent contributions to the discussion which you so aptly outline. It's an ethos inside of IOM that migration is beneficial broadly for society, and it's an opportunity. And I think the housing issue is a centerpiece of looking at that, how we make that so more operationally. First, let me reiterate that the right to adequate housing as an essential component to an adequate standard of living is a human right for all migrants, without discrimination and regardless of their status. Migrants are human beings, whatever their status is and whatever their location is. From here, the work and the challenges can run deep. We know that fulfilling the rights requires not only the provision of housing, but also to address the sort of wider scope of contextual factors, the socioeconomic, the legal, other systemic and structural barriers that migrants face, issues like security of tenure, affordability, which has been mentioned, and of course, tackling discrimination head on. Migrants are often exposed to exploitation and abuse. They're often subject to evictions. We see this in many countries, and homelessness. And this guides much of our work, which across the board, I should say, prioritizes at-risk and vulnerable groups. Many of you may know IOM. Globally, we are a very active operational partner, including on these issues. We're one of several key partners that work on housing, land, and property. Across the globe, IOM's delivering shelter and housing solutions for conflict and disaster-affected people and communities, including migrants. IOM has shelter, housing, and settlements work ongoing in 84 countries. Every year, this work, which I should add is well supported by our donorship, reaches close to 500,000 households, an estimated 2 million people, with various forms of shelter and housing support. We also support people on the move with access to transit and short-term temporary accommodation, particularly in emergency and in irregular movement situations. And our work in many places goes beyond just the provision of shelter or housing, but supporting the critical issue of access to housing as a critical step to a successful integration process for migrants who are arriving in new communities, and also for those returning home in the aftermath of conflict and disaster. To inform our operational work, it may be interesting to reference what we launched last year, the Global Shelter and Settlements Roadmap. Through this, we frame the primary importance of a rights-based approach to meeting people's needs, including for migrants. This, again, is about ensuring the security of tenure, addressing affordability, but also looking at the habitability and the condition of accommodations. And importantly, in a settlements approach, the availability of services particularly for employment and livelihoods, because we know that migrants contribute economically and socially to their communities. A few examples, perhaps in Greece, IOM supported over 45,000 individuals to lift skills and help their integration process. This included empowering 16,000 people to negotiate and secure rental housing of their choice. In Ecuador, we've done some interesting things in creating a safe landlord network, and that's about bringing parties together to educate landlords and tenants about rights and responsibilities. It also included work with municipalities about improving facilities and service provision. At the outset of conflict in Ukraine, IOM supported more than 7,000 migrants crossing borders to access short-term accommodation. About 11% of that group were what we call third country nationals who didn't otherwise have access to collective accommodation facilities or other forms of government support. Lastly, just to add a point, the lack of affordable housing, I think we're acknowledging here, is widespread. We see this globally on an increasing level, but it is being felt in most migrant hosting communities, perhaps more so than anywhere. So to secure adequate housing for migrants, there needs to be comprehensive and equitable policy developments to ensure access to social and affordable housing for everybody. An important avenue ahead is to focus on long-term structural policy approaches, much as we heard from the ambassador about work in Kenya. And work with government partners is essential to this effort. And let me close just by adding that a big part of this dialogue is also about the importance of expanding legal pathways for migrants, not just to reduce the risk and the vulnerabilities that they face, but to ensure that there are comprehensive policy approaches to ensuring that migrants are able to integrate, they're able to gain equitable access to housing and services. All as part of a process to ensure that there's a platform harnessing the contributions that migrants bring to new communities, and in many cases, back to their home communities in the aftermath of conflict and disaster. Thank you very much.
For highlighting the IOM contribution. Now I turn to Ms. Simona Barbu, who is a policy officer at the European Federation of National Organizations working with homeless people. In short, FIANSA, the only European network that focuses on combating homelessness. At FIANSA, Simona focuses the relation between migration and homelessness and advocating for ending migrants' homelessness. Previously, she was part of a leading Roma rights organization in Romania and has worked in Denmark with research project and for assisting migrants experiencing homelessness. I want to ask Ms. Simona, what are the key challenges faced by migrants accessing the right to adequate housing across European countries, and what factors lead them to homelessness?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for this kind introduction and for the invitation to be here today. At FANSA, we welcome highly the focus of this report, and we are glad to be contributing to this conversation as migration has come up among our membership in the past years. And it is something that we see as an increased interest. As it was said, we are a network of around 130 nonprofit services who support people experiencing homelessness with their daily needs, but also with counseling to exit homelessness. Our members are active across Europe, and from the data that we have available and also their own experiences, we see that migrants are overrepresented in homelessness, especially among those sleeping rough. So you can see how the topic of today's conversation is very relevant to us. Coming to your question about the factors that we see influencing people's access to adequate housing. It has been already mentioned several times, but nonetheless, I will have to highlight it once again. The ongoing affordable housing crisis, which Europe has witnessed for a long time now. And in the case of migrants, combined with high levels of discrimination and racism, this prevents people from accessing safe and adequate housing. We have seen very high rental prices and surging and a shortage of affordable options, which makes it difficult for those with a migration background to access housing. As we know that at the level of 2023, foreign-born people in Europe were almost twice as likely to be at risk of poverty and social exclusion than the native-born. And we also have seen that they are twice as likely to live in deprived and overcrowded accommodation. Additionally to this, the European Agency for Fundamental Rights has recorded that between 2016 to 2022, 31% of people of African descent have faced racial discrimination when trying to rent or to buy an apartment or a house. In the case of Muslims, this is happening in a perceived percentage of 26%. We also have examples from the coronavirus pandemic, which point to racial discrimination among seasonal workers, where people have been left homeless after their work contracts were ended and they were denied renting. And lastly, evidence from many European countries point to racism among private and public landlords, as well as real estate agencies. And we continue to face a lack of complaining mechanisms or hard access to these, especially for people who are in precarious migration statuses. To mention another factor which contributes to pushing people into destitution, including homelessness, as well as preventing them from accessing the right to housing, I would like to refer also to the European legislation on migration and asylum, which has become more and more restrictive, and also presents many gaps in its implementation. We found that countries across Europe have failed repeatedly to ensure that people searching for international protection have access to safe and adequate housing. And on the contrary, we continue to see repeatedly people sleeping on the streets after they have applied for international protection. And regrettably so here, we have seen women and children and unaccompanied minors, despite the fact that under European legislation, they should be benefiting from strengthened protection. So the lack of implementation of EU and national asylum reception law, as well as the non-compliance with court decisions. And unfortunately, we have seen this in Belgium, where our secretariat is based for the past 3 years at least, non-compliance with court decisions, court rulings. This raises high concerns as well in regards to the rule of law and the political will in ensuring the right to housing for people in search of protection in Europe. There is a connection to be made, of course, with discrimination also at the level of this type of legislation. And we have seen this concern in the latest development in the field of migration and asylum, as some of you might know it as the new Migration and Asylum Pact, which is a complex package of legislation that we fear will bring even more destitution and restrictions. And I think I am getting close to the time I have for today, but there's a lot to unpack here as well in terms of upcoming policies that will affect people's situation on the ground. And I would just like to close by inviting everyone to scan the QR code that hopefully we cannot display it right now, but we have made a short video about homelessness among asylum seekers with a focus on Brussels, also explain the situation at European level. Maybe we can circulate it later for people to scan and to watch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simona. Now we came to our last speaker, Ms. Olivia Solari Iriguen from Franciscans International. In her role, she supports Franciscans from the region to engage with the UN Human Rights Mechanism on issues related to poverty and migration, among others. She also works closely with the Franciscan Network for Migrants of the Americas, an informal coalition of Franciscans providing first-hand humanitarian assistance to migrants in 9 countries of the Americas. I will ask Ms. Olivia, what are the main barriers experienced by migrants in transit in Latin America to access adequate housing?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting Franciscans International to this event. We're very grateful for the Special Rapporteur's report, which is timely and useful for our work. For Franciscans International, the testimonies and experiences of Franciscans who directly assist and accompany the migrant population in Latin America are a unique source of information on the reality of human mobility in the region. This is particularly the case of the Franciscan Network for Migrants of the Americas, which is a key partner of Franciscan International and brings together Franciscans who provide direct humanitarian assistance to migrants in 9 countries of the Americas, which was the map. In Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Panama, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, and the United States. They provide assistance also to migrants in transit who are mostly heading to North America, fleeing poverty, violence, climate-related events, and political persecution. Given the openly hostile migration actions and sentiment across the region, accentuated by the militarization and remain in Mexico type of policies, as well as racist and xenophobic rhetoric, migrants transiting Latin America en route to the United States are forced to make their way through treacherous routes that expose them to multiple risks, mistreatment, and human rights violations, including death and enforced disappearances. During their journey that can last weeks, even months, migrants in transit are also forced to endure highly precarious living conditions in which they have limited access to food, to clean water, sanitation, health, and shelters. They face numerous barriers to accessing adequate housing, including economic constraints that do not allow everyone to stay at a hotel or to rent housing. If you embark on this type of journey, it can cost anywhere from $3,000 to more than $10,000 US, including the multiple extortion fees. And migrants in transit are also robbed multiple times during their journey. Legal and documentation issues are also a significant barrier to accessing housing and basic services like healthcare that can be sometimes overlooked. Many migrants don't have their IDs either because they were stolen along the way or because they had to leave the country without the possibility of obtaining identity documents. And this is particularly the situation of many Venezuelans, which, as you know, migrants, it constitutes the largest displacement crisis in Latin America and recent history. Discrimination can also be a barrier. In some hotels, for example, the stay of migrants in transit is explicitly prohibited as they are associated with criminals or the owners feel being reprimanded by government authorities for helping undocumented migrants. Some are forced to sleep on the street, on railroad track, in bus stations, or in public places such as parks where they're vulnerable to organized crime, drug cartels, human trafficking and smuggling, but also to scam, extortion, and violence from police and national migration officers. The fact that migrants in transit and their specific needs are seldom considered in policy making, including around housing, is another barrier. To start concluding, I would like to simply reflect on a recent trend about migrants in transit that is being reported in the region, which is that as a result of desisting from their intent to reach the United States in consequence to the United States' new administration and migration policy, migrants in transit who had already embarked on the journey but had not yet reached the United States are increasingly starting to travel back south to return to their country of origin or usual residence or to settle in another country. And this raises questions and challenges on how to best reintegrate these individuals in their countries and ensure the protection of their rights, including the right to adequate housing. The report of the Special Rapporteur is extremely valuable for reminding us about the interdependence of human rights, and that to secure the right to housing for everyone, including migrants, we cannot work in silos. Similarly, analyzing the structural causes of human rights violations that migrants face, including due to the lack of human rights-based approach to migration policies and the prevalence of racist and xenophobic rhetoric, is fundamental in ensuring the right to housing for this population group.
Thank you, Ms. Olivia, for your thoughtful remarks. Now I will open the floor for questions, also from online. Yes, I see two hands. Yeah, please.
Nadima Rahimli for Social Welfare of Citizens Public Union from Azerbaijan. We also thank to Special Rapporteur in order, as he spoke about adequate housing and so on. Now, today, I don't want to speak about as a social, as a representative of civil society. I will speak as a victim of it because I'm a refugee myself. I'm a refugee from Armenia. My families, they were deported forcefully in 1988, and 300,000 people were deported from Armenia. And you know, when we came to Azerbaijan, of course, the government did something, but in initial stage, we were living in camps, we were living in tents, we were living in the unused trains and so on. But later, of course, Azerbaijani government did something, we had some properties and so on. But again, most of the people are still homeless. So I would like to ask you, as distinguished Special Rapporteur said, that sometimes it's not dependent on one country. No, it's dependent. Armenian side have enough opportunity to let us back to return to our homes and to live in peaceful, because, you know, we lived for centuries with them. We were as a part of this Armenian community. But unfortunately, for some, I don't know, for ethnic issues, for the religious issues, we were deported. So I would kind of ask you to have any kind of pressure on Armenian government in order to let us, at least 300,000 of Azerbaijanis, of course, you know, they have children and so, and the numbers are more, but we want to go back to live in peace, to live in safety in Armenia as we used to live there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Take two more questions. Now I give the floor to Mexico.
Thank you. I would like to thank the co-sponsors for organizing this event. I believe it's very timely, and also thank the Special Rapporteur for his report and all the panelists for their very insightful presentations. For us, it's very important to address the issue of housing for migrant persons. And we also would like to share the comments that we heard from the Special Rapporteur on the need to lament and condemn those attacks against migrants, and also the stigmatization of migrants causing or being a part of the housing crisis when they are suffering that housing crisis in particular. We are very concerned about the current trend on attacks and use of discriminatory and hate language against migrants because of the violent consequences that this may have. As you may know, Mexico is a country of origin, of also destination, of transit, and of return of migrants. We have all the different possibilities of migration, and we are very attached on respecting human rights of migrants and refugees in this regard, and trying to work for them to be integrated if possible. But we also face a lot of challenges, and many of them are stemming from the policies that are being implemented right now by the US administration in this regard. And we support the favoring of integration of migrants and welcome the Kenya example. I think it's a very important to take that into account. And we also reiterated many times that it's important to address the causes, the root causes of migration. And that's why we are also investing in the development, for example, in Central America and the Caribbean, to allow people to stay in their countries of origin and not push the flows of migration. And finally, we believe it's important, and that's why we thank you very much for this event, that we hear more the voice of the UN in addressing the issue of rights of migrants and also condemning this language of hate and discrimination against migrants, not only of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the special procedures, but also the specialized agencies such as the IOM, the UNHCR, in this regard, because this trend can really be dangerous for migrants and for people around the world. Thank you very much.
To NGO, please introduce yourself first and then ask the question.
Thank you, Chair. Robert Lewis Lessington from UN Habitat. First, I would like to express my appreciation to the panel, to the co-organizers, and also particularly to Kenya. I regard myself as perhaps a serial migrant, and 25 years of that was in Kenya. So thank you very kindly for hosting and accepting my presence, and that of my organization. We are very glad to be hosted there. I bring that directly to the sort of first of three quick points I'd like to make. One, this whole question of, and I think it's highlighted in the introduction to the ESA's report, the normalization of migration. It's not a freak thing. It's not an unusual thing. It's been going on forever, and migrants are a very active and positive force in our society, the same way that we find informal settlements are very often an integral and important part of a successful city. They deliver a service, they perform a function, they're part of our societies. So emphasizing that need for normalization around a lot of the dialogue, and we fully support that. In terms of the questions, I wonder, one, I read in a lot of this case what we come across typically, which is the problem isn't about migration, the problem is about housing systems. We have weak housing systems, and then issues of migration, along with many other issues, will show up that we have a weak or a bad system that we need to strengthen. Is that a fair comment? And similarly, I'm struggling in many situations to see, for example, we are frequently pushed with the situation of we must look at how to facilitate housing markets, how we must look at private-public partnerships. But I don't see how the private sector can effectively respond to the long-term trends and scenarios that come up with good planning for migration. You have to have a public role. You can argue ideologically whether that's public housing or whether it's public guidance and regulation, but you need a strong public role, and this is part of the retreat of the public from housing systems. And again, I would put the comment of, is that a fair conclusion to draw? Thank you.
Due to shortage of time,
Habitat.
I will give back floor to Special Rapporteur to answer these questions and also to wrap up the discussion.
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly on the Armenian question, as it's a question for any other individual who finds himself or herself outside of the country, that there is a right to return if you're a national of a country under international law back to your country. But the bigger issue is also the conditions under which the return actually happens in a way that still makes it possible to fully realize all the human rights when you return. Because as I point out in the report, what we also find is that sometimes when people who are refugees return, they've fled to other countries, but when they return, they find that accessing housing is very difficult. Their previous housing, for example, has been appropriated or has been distributed, or that they have other constraints in accessing housing. This is something that needs to be particularly paid attention to for those who are returning. Regarding the comment from Mexico, I'm grateful for your intervention, and I hope we will have the intervention when we have the session tomorrow. That I think it's terribly important that this whole narrative that migrants are villains and they are here to create problems, and the demonization that goes along with it, including portraying them as subhuman and implicitly legitimizing really acts of violence against migrants and foreigners, along with the militarization of responses to migration, including, in the case of the United States, the brief sort of repurposing of Guantanamo as a holding facility, the deployment of armed forces, including the military, for border control, which is not really, something that has been done and not consistent with domestic law in the United States as well. These are enormously dangerous, slippery slope measures and not consistent with any fundamental idea of a society based on human rights at all. So I very much sort of agree with that, that we need to pay close attention to this and reframe the whole conversation. And I hope that's one of the purposes of the debate. It must have been clear that I hope that this debate will contribute to that reframing. And thank you, Robert, again, for that very important intervention. Just very quickly on the question of whether weak housing systems rather than migration is the real problem. Of course, weak housing systems are a problem, but you also find that in countries with more robust housing systems, migrants actually end up having some peculiar difficulties on their own. And I've seen that in countries where they don't have problems at all when it comes to even affordability. I'm thinking of a country like Singapore. But on the other hand, migrants invariably end up having problems that the nationals don't. And that raises a question of whether the extent to which a rights-based approach that ensures non-discrimination, that, as the ambassador from Kenya said, the essence of the approach to migration should be dignity of all human beings. It doesn't matter what your status is, but you should have access to fundamental human rights, one of which is, of course, access to adequate housing. So thanks a lot for these questions. And let me again thank the panelists and the chair.
Thank you all for attending the event. So thanks again.